I say hello.
Well, I think we've all heard the stories of the little boy that dies and goes to heaven, sees Jesus, some old family members, etc. Becomes a best-selling book, maybe even a movie. And recently you might have heard that one of those stories was retracted. The little boy said he made up the whole story because that's what he knew his family wanted to hear. But the bigger story that it all raises, obviously, whether it's a little boy or a neurosurgeon or a guy that was hit by a Mack truck, the question that it raises is, what is the relationship between the soul and the body? Do we live after our body comes to an end? Do we live eternally? In what state do we live? Do we live right now as a body, as well as a soul? Those are the questions before us. Thanks so much for downloading and listening to the Sin Boldly podcast. We put it out through the church, as well as through soon, I hope, KPFT. And we're doing this podcast. It's a generally Christian apologetics podcast, as well as doing some discernment within the church. Our church's website is felchouston.org. You can email me at emc2@felchouston.org. If you have any questions about the show or anything you'd like me to ask, or anything you'd just like to get in touch with me about, that's how to do it, and maybe we could talk about something on the air. I do have a standing offer to if you're a theological liberal and you'd like to come on, maybe have a little sparring session, maybe a little friendly conversation. That would be fun. I don't want people to think I'm just holding court here. I'd love to hear from people of a different point of view. And in the long run, I'd love to do some in-studio debates as well, between maybe atheists and believers. But we'll talk about that another day. What we're talking about today is the soul, whether there is a soul, or if basically we are just physical beings that walk around. I always bring in a guest to help me with these more philosophical matters, because that's not a strong suit of mine. So Eric Hernandez, who is with me, is back in studio with us today. So Eric, how you doing?
Great, good to be with you.
Thanks for coming back. So last time we talked about the moral argument for God. All this stuff is kind of related, but in the end, the Christian claim, of course, is that there is more to this world than mere matter, mere nature. So we would reject the materialist point of view, the naturalist point of view, etc. One of the topics that is a study for you is the soul, or the existence of the soul. I think synonymous words or related words would be mind or spirit. Is that fair to say?
Right. They're part of the soul.
Okay. So sometimes those words are kind of used interchangeably, and modern ways that people speak, they talk about the mind, but what they really mean is the brain, or maybe some people will say brain, but what they really mean is mind.
Usually have, people these days, usually whenever I talk about the soul in a class or something and I'm teaching, I ask a trick question. I say, what part of your body thinks? And virtually everyone says your brain.
Okay.
And that's kind of where I kind of lure them into that conversation.
So what we're going to try to get at today is basically to I'm just going to let people know what the goal line is here. So what we want to do is we want to just ask the question if a materialist only worldview is really even possible. And I think one of the best counters to that is the existence of the soul, or arguing for the existence of the soul. So Eric, first, before we go any further, how do people find you and get a hold of you and follow your ministry?
Well, we have a website, erichernandezministries.com. On there you can find access to, or links even rather, to a bunch of other social media that we have. Also on there we have a blog where I have about 20 questions on there that I've answered, people submitting questions. I think we even have at least 3 on the soul, one talking about the animal soul, one talking about the human soul, free will, and stuff like that. Facebook, Eric Hernandez Ministries, you can give us a like. I post up where I'm speaking at, upcoming debates, lectures that I'll be giving, stuff of that nature. On YouTube, we have videos. Recently at Unshackled Church, I did the apologetics course in 4 days, and they recorded it, and we were able to post that up. So you can find the apologetics course videos on the YouTube channel. Twitter, every now and then I'll post something on Twitter. I'm not too
not a prolific tweeter.
Right. I'm just don't know how to use it as good as all these other kids do. But
yeah.
right. So either erichernandezministries.com, Facebook, anything like that.
All right, cool. Good deal. So that's where to go to find you. And we're working on a debate for the fall, but I can't say anything about it yet because it's still in process. But it might be about this topic or related to this topic, and it could be a lot of fun if we can pull it off. But we're still in a negotiating phase for something like that. Okay, give me a summary, if you will, of what we're talking about when we talk about the soul. I think a lot of people sort of assume it, they take it for granted, but they've never thought about it in depth. And for people who are not believers, they pretty much have to, this might be too big of a statement, but I would say necessarily conclude that the soul doesn't exist. Maybe, is that too broad to say that a naturalist would have to assume that the soul can't exist? Or
for the most part, exactly. Naturalists cannot. What a naturalist believes is basically that the only thing that exists is physical matter, things that you can touch. So nothing non-physical exists. Well, the problem with that is that if there's nothing non-physical that exists, then there's no soul. Now, who cares? Well, if there's no soul, there's a lot of things that you have to leave out. When we talk about this, for example, you can say if there's nothing immaterial to you, then you can't have free will. If there's no soul, well, why is that? Because if all you are is a purely physical machine, well, physical machines don't have free will. If I were to say go up to a Coke machine, put in $1 and push a button, it's not going to sing a song to me. It's going to give me a Coke. Why? Because the inputs that are put into it are already determined to do or act in a certain way. So if I'm purely a physical machine, I have no free will. All my actions are determined by the laws of physics and chemistry. I don't shoot a bullet up in the air, and the bullet doesn't say, well, I'm tired of obeying the laws of motion, let me swerve left instead of going straight up, because it is a purely physical machine. If there's no soul, then you don't have a mind that's independent of the brain. Well, again, who cares? What's the difference between a mind and a brain? Well, if all you are is a brain, that's just an electrolyzed piece of meat, and brains react. They don't think for themselves. Well, the problem with that is that means there's no consciousness. Well, if there's no consciousness, you don't have things like intentions, thoughts, beliefs, feelings, sensations. So without a soul, there's no consciousness and all those things that come with it. Rocks don't have beliefs. Rocks don't have intentions. Also, there's a quote here by J.B.S. Haldane, who's actually an atheist, and he says, in summary, he pretty much says, if your mind is basically just matter, he says, then your mental processes are wholly determined by the motions of atom in my brain, and I have no reason to believe that my thoughts are true. Basically, he's saying if my brain came about by a purely naturalistic, unguided process, if my brain is a product of irrationality, how can I derive rationality from it? John Lennox goes on to even touch on that, and he says, my main objection to atheism is not that it's against God, but that it's against reasoning. If you have a brain that is just brought about by evolution, then why do you believe anything that says it's true? Because including the belief that your brain is made of atoms.
Right.
So there's just a lot of problem with that. If there's no soul there, you can't have an afterlife. Now, of course, for a naturalist or an atheist, well, who cares? They don't want an afterlife. But the point is, if you are more than a body, then it's at least possible that there's an afterlife. If there's no soul, again, why believe anything your brain thinks? If there's no soul and all you are is your body, well, the funny thing is that you get a new body every about 7 to 10 years. So let's say I commit a crime 10 years ago, and they barely found out it was me 10 years later, and I say, well, Judge, that wasn't me. That was some guy 10 years ago. Go get him. He doesn't exist anymore. So if there's no soul, there's no free will, and then that goes into even moral accountability. Whatever I did, I can't be morally accountable for it because it wasn't me. It was just the music of my DNA, and I'm simply dancing to it.
Yeah. I do want to take one issue because JFK conspiracy theorist would say that bullets have free will, which explains the pristine bullet theory. But anyway, we'll maybe talk about that another day. What is the view of you mentioned animal? What was that? Animal spirits or
animal souls?
Animal souls. So everyone believes that dogs don't go to heaven except for their dog, of course, who will be with them forever and ever. I think one of the reasons that we love dogs and we put certain animals in a different category is because they seem to have souls. I mean, they seem to have personality. Do they, or is it just that they have cleverly learned to live with human beings for their own survival?
Well, Well, the point is, again, to even have any kind of free will or anything, you would need something aside from something physical. Your soul is what animates your body, and what gives you that motion, what gives you that free will, and so forth. So the reason I would, and the Bible does teach that animals have souls. It's a very recently modern concept that animals don't have souls. If you read the word for animal, it's the word uses nefesh, which means a soulish animal. So animals do have souls. They have an animated body. They have thoughts. They have beliefs. They have sensations. They have desires. Now, the difference between our soul and an animal soul is that, and this is now we're getting a little bit deeper into the soul and the faculty, what you would call the faculties of the soul. You have certain faculties, which is basically a body of capacities. For example, I have and then you have states of the soul. Like, okay, for example, I have beliefs. And I have thoughts. Those are states of the soul, a state that my soul's in. Now, why are those two different? Because I can have beliefs I'm not thinking, and I can think things that I don't believe. So these are two different things. I don't have to think about my beliefs, but they're still there. But a thought can only exist as long as I'm thinking it. Now, the difference between our soul and an animal soul, and souls are different, especially among different living things, is that I can have thoughts about my thoughts. I can think, you know what, my beliefs in this area aren't really too good. I really need to strengthen them. Or I can have a conflict of duty and moral obligation. A dog can't. A dog doesn't think about its thoughts. A dog doesn't think, you know, my thought about this is really poor. I really need to work on that. Or you know, my reasoning in this area isn't so good. I really need to fix that. So dogs don't have beliefs about their beliefs.
There's not a self-awareness.
Right.
Is that, I don't know if that's part of it or not. But, I mean, they I guess in some way they know that they exist, but they don't actually know that they exist. Or
right. Actually, yeah, which would even go into animal suffering, because which is another field in itself. But even in their self-awareness, they're not self-aware of even in a level of awareness of pain as we are. When we feel pain, we know this hurts, and I'm the one who hurting, and I'm the one who exists, and I know who I am. Whereas an animal doesn't have that type of awareness.
They obviously feel pain,
right?
But we would never say that an animal doesn't feel pain, but that he doesn't have the same awareness
of pain that we do. For example, when I stick a bacteria with a needle, it reacts. And then, you know, versus maybe when I stick a needle in a jellyfish, it also may react. So different animals have different types of the souls. The souls are very intricate. They have faculties. Think of it like a chest of drawer. You have a sock drawer, you have an underwear drawer, and so forth. The soul also has compartments. It has states, certain states of the soul, and then it has capacities. And for example, I have the capacity to see red. I have the capacity to see orange. I have the capacity to smell a flower or to smell coffee. Now, seeing red and orange are more closely related, so that's the faculty of sight. Smelling an orange, smelling coffee are also closely related capacities. Those go into a group of faculties called the faculty of smell, which goes even deeper. And I don't know if you want to go here, but even, for example, my eyeballs don't see, my soul sees. And the reason I can see is because I have a soul with the capacity to see, and I have an equally properly functioning eye that allows me to see.
Okay, my optometrist has never told me that. I'm just saying. He looks into my eyes with that bright light after they've been dilated, and he's like, there's your soul in there. No, but you're saying that the soul and the body work together. So let me ask you this. So I have a dog, and, you know, honestly, people do assume dogs have personality, and even that word personality may not, even that is borrowing from capital from another place. But when I teach my dog to sit, am I teaching his soul to sit, or am I teaching his brain to sit?
Good question, and that goes fundamentally into what we are. For example, is your dog a body, or is your dog does he have a soul? Is that what he is? Am I a body, or am I a soul? If I can go back to the eyeball example that we were talking about. For example, when I ask people what part of your body thinks, and I say your brain, if they're a Christian, I say, well, let me ask you this: does God have a brain? And they're very hesitant to say no. Well, they don't want to say yes, because then that would mean God has a body. But they don't want to say no because in our culture, not having brains means you're stupid, you're dumb. The problem is that that's more of a, for lack of a better word, a brainwashing of a naturalistic worldview to say that we have to reduce everything to something physical. So our mental actions are reduced to our brain. Now, why is that? Because you're asking about your dog. Who are you teaching to sit? Well, your dog is one thing. I am one thing. I am a soul, but but I have a body. So I am what you call a substance dualist. There's two substances to me. I have a body, but I am a soul.
Okay.
So when I die, my body doesn't continue to exist, but I do, unless of course we're talking about the resurrection.
Okay.
So I am essentially a soul, and the soul has different faculties and capacities, such as a mind, a spirit, and whatnot. So it is me that thinks. Now, what's the relation, of course, is the next question, because I said earlier, and I'm sure our listeners are thinking, well, how is it that my eyes don't see? If I pluck my eyeballs out, I can't see. Well, very true. Much like a musician who uses a piano, first of all, the talent's not in the piano. You can't open up the piano and find the note C. You can't find E flat in the piano. If I were to take, let's say if I were to take you apart piece by piece, I couldn't find Evan anywhere in your body. I couldn't take you apart and say, oh, there he is, I found him. Here's Evan. Because you're not your body. Much like a piano, if I were to take it apart, I can't find any music. I won't find Beethoven's symphony in the piano. However, without a properly functioning piano that is tuned well, I cannot play Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Much like without properly functioning eyeballs, even though my soul has a capacity to see, I can't see.
Yeah. So, so similarly, so I teach my dog to sit, and he knows how to sit. I mean, he's learned that. And yet, there are many times when I tell him to sit, and he knows exactly what I'm asking him to do, but he doesn't want to sit. Because he knows so I get him to the front door, and we have this routine. At the end of the day, he does his last, time outside, and he's always hoping that there is a cat right by the front door so he can chase after the cat, and we have all these cats by our house. That's a whole other story. So he knows that what I want to do is I want him to sit and basically calm down so that when I open the front door, he will remain seated so that he will not chase after the cat. Now, he knows what I'm doing. I mean, and he basically tests me to see how many times I'll tell him to sit and how long I will wait for him to sit before he sits. He doesn't just sit the first time. He's not that obedient. So my point is that he has a stubborn streak in him. He is in a process of negotiating with me, basically. And he's smart enough to do that.
Right.
So anyway, so what you would say is that he has a brain, but it's not his brain that's negotiating with me.
Right.
It's in its fact a soul that is negotiating with me, and he is using his brain. Would you say in part of that negotiation, just like we use our brain when we in everyday life? So
right, and I would just be cautious to use brain only because again, you are using your brain in this, or rather, let's clarify what we're meaning by that. Just like a musician uses an instrument to play music, we are using our brain. Our minds are using our brain to convey the message to our body or whatnot, and again, we don't need a brain to think. However, in this body, we are using our brain to convey the messages, because, for example, if I were to have, one thing I hear naturalists say all the time, an atheist would say, well, if I have some type of brain damage, I can lose memory. Well, of course, just like if I'm playing a guitar and I pluck a string, I can no longer perhaps play a specific note because I lost a string. Again, that doesn't mean that we are now that we are our brains and merely our bodies. It means that we use them, and there's definitely a correlation there.
Okay. Couple of quick questions that come up that I think would come up. If animals have souls, do those souls carry on after death? And
there's different views on that, but mainly there really is two views on that. It's either yes, they do, and two is no, they don't. J.P. Moreland, who is an expert on this topic, on the soul, and he even goes into neuroscience and whatnot, and we can go into that later if you'd like. His view is that the reason we live on in the afterlife is first of all because we're made in the image of God, and God cannot annihilate us, which I mean, another topic would be annihilation, when there's a view that some Christians take that hell is being annihilated and taken out of existence. I don't take that, because God respects us too much in His image, and we are worth so much that He cannot do that. So the best thing to do is to quarantine us.
So conscience eternal torment. Although people hear that as torture, but that's not necessarily what happens in hell. But anyway,
right.
So that would be the alternative view.
Right, yeah. And now when it comes to animals, his view is that God doesn't simply give them that privilege of living on in the afterlife. I'm not sure what position I take, because there's references to animals in the afterlife for whatever the reason. And of course, the afterlife will have it will be physical. So I don't know if God would recreate animals, or if they simply aren't there. Or if God gives them the privilege of living on in the afterlife. So.
Yeah. Well, or if the afterlife is the Garden of Eden done right, which some people feel, without the fall, then certainly there would be animals there. Heck, there. I actually take the view in the afterlife that one of the chief things that we will do is we will work. I mean, I really believe that we will work in the afterlife, but we will not toil. Because Adam enjoyed his work before the fall, and animals may very well be a part of that.
Right.
Of that labor, and then there would be a right relationship between animals. I guess you get into other more difficult questions of, because there's imagery of lions laying down with lambs.
Right.
Boy, lions are a touchy subject this week. What is up with all these people poaching wild animals now? But anyway, but I don't know if that's metaphorical or poetic imagery for the resurrection, or because I also don't know, and we don't have to answer this, but I also don't know how there could be a kind of functioning agricultural physical world in the afterlife if there's not predation and prey. But we don't need to answer that. But the question is, so some people do think that the soul of an animal could carry on.
Some believe that God simply doesn't give them that privilege.
Okay.
So it's there's, as far as I'm concerned, I don't know of any consensus. But I know Moreland himself takes the view that God simply doesn't give them that privilege.
You mentioned the other phrase I was going to bring up, which is the image of God, because at some point, someone listening to this, a Christian in particular, is going to be saying, wait a minute, these guys are giving animals way too much credit. They're giving them way too much. So the key distinction, though, between humanity and the animal world, so if it's not the fact that we have a soul, then it would have to be that we are made in the image of God.
Right.
And so therefore,
and our souls are made differently too. As I said, we can have beliefs about our beliefs. We can have thoughts about our thoughts.
Okay. So that's a body, and it's really more the soul is made in the image of God. And now later Christ becomes the image of man, but I'm thinking of Psalm 8 now, made a little bit lower than the angels. There's so much in the scriptures that elevates humanity above the animals, and the charge that Adam gets over the animals. But what fundamentally makes us different from animals is the fact that our soul is made in the image of God.
Right, we are made in the image of God.
And I would say, and we'll get to this more later, but I would also say that we are, at the resurrection, we're finally made in the image of Christ, because we'll have flesh that is incorruptible. But so that's the game changer that Jesus throws into the whole mix. But let's get back to the or not back, but let's just what I want to make sure is that we draw a sharp line here between the understanding. Give us a 1-minute summary of what a naturalistic or a materialistic worldview is, and then obviously I think where it would come down on this question, if that's possible.
Okay, a scientific naturalist, a naturalist would basically say that, again, there is nothing immaterial that exists. So in their mind, the only way to explain our existence the only game they have is evolution, Darwinian evolution. And they would say, so now here's a problem for the naturalists. And what's funny is you have a lot of naturalists nowadays who are actually, for lack of a better word, coming out of the closet and saying this problem of consciousness, the soul, the mind, poses a huge threat to us. Here's why. Because if all there is physical material things, for example, let me look for the... there's a quote here by evolutionist Paul Churchland. He says, the important point about the standard evolutionary theory is that the human species and all of its features are wholly physical outcome of a purely physical process. If this is a correct account of our origins, then there seems neither need nor room to fit any non-physical substances or properties into our theoretical account of ourselves. We are creatures of matter, and we should learn to live with that fact. So you have a lot of people, even Daniel Dennett, he goes as far as to say, well, look, there's just no such thing as consciousness. Why? Because if you allow for consciousness, then you have to allow for something immaterial. Darwin himself had issues with the soul, and he openly stated, well, look, my account is a purely physical account of how we came to be. If you start talking about things like minds and consciousness, then you have to account for something immaterial. Well, my theory can explain something immaterial. So you'll have to say something like God did it, and if you're going to attribute God to creating our consciousness, then you might as well give him go to create everything else. Thomas Nagel, who's another a very prominent atheist. Now, he's not a Christian, and he's not even a theist. He's in fact an anti-theist. He's often said, I don't want God to exist. I don't want to live in that kind of world. He wrote a book recently called Mind and Cosmos, and if I can get the subtitle correct, it's why something to the effect of why the naturalistic naturalism is almost certainly false. And he's basically saying that this problem of consciousness, intentionality, meaning, purpose, and those things, why it poses a huge threat. And if I can quote him here, he says, towards the end, he says, I will be willing to bet that the present consensus, the present naturalistic, materialistic, physicalistic consensus, will come to seem laughable in a generation or two. So he's basically saying it's very plausible that what we think about the world now isn't correct because we can't account for the mind, for consciousness. So again, real quick, Darwinian evolution, if that's true, then all that says is how something was done to matter, and then you get more complicated stuff, chunks of matter. Then you do more things to matter, then you get more matter. How in the world, by simply rearranging matter, do you get mind squirting into existence, intentionality, purpose, meaning, value, things like that, things that are not material? So they have to reduce everything to something physical. So what is love? Well, take a brain scan. You see this part of your brain lighting up. That's love right there.
It's pheromones when the right girl walks by and
right,
whatever,
and that's love. And the problem with that is, if we can kind of get into this a little bit, the reason we don't believe the brain and mind are the same thing is because there's different properties about them. I don't know if you want to get into it now or not.
Sure.
Okay, you have different things have different properties.
Okay.
You have a brain that has certain properties, and then you have your mind that has certain properties. Now here's the catch here. Leibniz has something called the Leibniz law of identity, which basically says if two things are identical, that is to say they're the same thing, then what's true of one must be true of the other. So, for example, if Eric Hernandez is the same person as the guest on your show today, then whatever is true of Eric Hernandez must be true of your guest. So if Eric Hernandez is 5'6", your guest must be 5'6". If he weighs 180, then your guest must weigh 180. But if I can show one thing true of one that is not true of the other, we have shown they're not the same thing.
Okay.
To give just one more quick example, let's pretend we didn't know nothing about the number 2 or 6, and we're barely finding out about the number 2 and 6. And the first question we ask is, well, are they both numbers? Yes. Okay, check. So far they're identical. Are they both even? Check. So far they're identical. Are they both divisible by 3? No. Okay, but then they're not identical.
Okay.
That in mind, you have a brain state. What is a brain state? Well, brain states are something like you can measure it. You can weigh how much a brain is. You can see its shape, its size. Now contrast that with a mental state. Mental states are things like thoughts. Now, it makes sense to ask how much does a brain weigh, but it makes no sense to ask how many pounds does a thought of my mother's cooking weigh. How many pounds does a taste of banana weigh? That just doesn't make any sense. You can measure how many inches long the brain is, but it makes no sense to ask how many inches long is the smell of a rose. Of that, how many? So you can right away, that alone would prove that these two are not the same thing. Let's try another one. Whenever you have going back to the love, or let's say they look at your brain and they ask you to think about this or that, and certain brain firings happen, which is great. So you have a brain state of a fire brain. That's a brain state. And then you also have brain state of thoughts or beliefs, like today is, let's say I thought today was Saturday. If I said today is Saturday, well, that is either true or false. So a thought can be true or false, but a brain state, such as a fire brain, cannot be true or false. So if a scientist were to look at a brain firing, it makes no sense to say, oh, look at that right there. That brain firing, that's true. That just doesn't make any sense. But you can think of a thought, today is Saturday, and think that's true or false. Right. So a brain state cannot be true or false, but a thought can be true or false. So again, these two things would go to show that they are not the same thing.
Okay. I want to go back to the evolution question a little bit, because let's say that we conceded Darwinian evolution. I mean, basically. Let's say that all things come... And by the way, the full title for that book by Thomas Nagel, Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. Yeah, it's a pretty strong argument.
And mind you, he's an atheist.
And he's an atheist, yeah. Let's say that we conceded evolution, and this comes up a lot in the intelligent design arguments. But essentially, that what is hard to understand about Darwinian evolution is the fact that things get more and more complex over time. In other words, information is added, and that is not actually what we observe in evolution, but actually what we would observe, if anything, is a loss of information, because it's easy to lose things, but it's a lot harder to gain things without a mind. So some people would argue that evolution itself is only possible if there is such a thing as consciousness, or if there is such a thing as a mind, or maybe we would say an external process guiding the whole thing. So let me ask it this way: is Darwinian evolution, let's say we granted it, okay, would it be possible, as is understood, as the accumulation of more and more complexity and more information over time, and by the way, a purposefulness isn't purpose assumed in evolution, right? For example, a wasp evolved a certain way because its forefathers, that's not the right word, but the wasp that went before it realized that hatching eggs in this way wasn't good, so it'd be much better if we could carve out the body of a caterpillar, cannibalize it for a couple of weeks, put our eggs in there, and then that would be a safe place to lay eggs. Are we putting purpose onto that, or doesn't that imply purpose? That somewhere along the way the wasp said, wouldn't it be better if we could tell ourselves to evolve in this way? I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I don't even understand the concept of evolution without something else in addition to mere material. Even that material somewhere along the way has to say the better way for us to be designed would be this. So there's some guiding force. There's some mind at play. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, and basically, and I don't know if we touched on this last time when we talked about morality, but that basically, to say there's a better way would assume that there's a best, which would point to what we would call teleology, which is a goal, a purpose, or an end. So, for example, an evolutionist can't appeal to that, because if they talk about a purpose or a goal, then they automatically assume teleology, which is exactly that, a function. If they assume a function, then they have to assume some type of a design of engineering. If they assume that, they have to assume a designer.
Yeah.
So an evolutionist can't say the reason our heart pumps so that it can pass blood through our body. It has to say the reason hearts pump blood is because back then this heart pumped blood and survived, this heart didn't. So the organisms that had good hearts that pump blood, or you can't even really say good, because again that it points to a design. You'd have to say the reason that these hearts nowadays pump blood is because they survive, versus the ones that didn't pump blood, they didn't survive. That's why we have hearts that pump blood. They can't say the reason your heart pumps blood is so that, or for the sake of, or for this end, purpose, or goal.
Yeah. Well, and even that would be a 35,000 foot view of evolution. And actually on my church's podcast feed, there's a lecture by Dr. James Tour from Rice University, who is one of the world's great nanotechnologists and neuroscientists, and he was so gracious to give a lecture. And basically he argues, where is the proof for evolution at the molecular level? That is something that no one has been able to mount. But that's a whole other question. But I think, what the point is that there is intentionality. We assume intentionality in everything from ourselves, our dogs, and then we work. But actually, you'd have to trace it down all the way, because intentionality. Although we would say that human beings are created in the image of God, so there is a definite break between us and the rest of nature. But within nature, I don't know. It seems like there has to be. There has to be intentionality, even if we granted evolution, for it to actually work, because it's going toward design, it's going toward purpose, it's going toward working better. Anyway, I don't know if that's I just wanted to make sure that we didn't leave the evolution thing and just in any way sound like we're obviously we're not granting it, but even if we granted it, it just seems impossible without there being there being a force behind it. So.
Right, and that is an argument for the soul's intentionality. Again, rocks don't have intentions. An intention. Matter doesn't have intention. So if you have any intentions, there has to be something to you other than your physical body. So evolution could. Let's grant evolution, like you said, just for a second, for the sake of argument. Evolution could tell us where our bodies came from, but if I'm not my body, it can't even begin to tell us where I came from.
Yeah.
And that's the point.
Yeah. Okay, so let me ask this. Mostly at this point, if you want to defend the materialist point of view, that we don't need an outside or a separate state of being, like a soul, that basically neuroscience and the brain can account for everything. I mean, it can account for, let's just say everything. There was a book I read a couple of years ago, and even though I'm not really into heaven tourism book, and it's not quite a heaven tourism book. The whole thrust of this book is that there is such a thing as consciousness apart from the body, which is written by Evan Alexander. He's a neurosurgeon. It's called Proof of Heaven. And again, the way he describes this heaven it's nothing like, say, heaven is for real, where there are winged creatures and you see Jesus. It was kind of strange, actually. But the point is that he claims, and there some aspects of the book have been disputed, but he claims that he was clinically dead, had no brain activity for a long period of time, and yet he has memories of definite experiences. So, anyway, what is the what is the neuroscientific argument against the soul, and what might we say in response to that?
Basically, it's a reductionist point of view, like we've been talking about. They have to reduce everything to the brain. So, for example, just like atheists will say that we don't need God, because Richard Dawkins says all the time, that evolution made it an intellectually viable option to be an atheist. And they say because of evolution, we now know where we came from. We don't need God. But of course, as I said earlier, evolution could explain where my body came from, but if I'm not my body, it cannot explain where I came from. Mm-hmm. But what they'll say is, just like evolution explains away God, neuroscience would explain the way a soul. My second philosophy professor, who was an atheist, and I had the privilege of debating a few years ago, he, I actually, I guess I can give him some credit for pushing me to study the soul indirectly. So it's funny how God even uses atheists in our lives to study topics. And I remember one day in class we walk in, and he says, this whole idea of the soul is just really absurd. He says, if I can take a pill, an antidepressant pill or any kind of pill, and it can change my mood, and if these theists believe that your mood and your sensations rely on your soul, then how can something physical affect the immaterial? Mm-hmm. I take a pill, my mood changes. Well, if I have a soul, why should a pill change my soul? That's just ridiculous. And when he said that, it just kind of stopped me in my tracks. And of course, I'm a freshman in college, and it really made me start to think, how would I answer this? And really, one of the driving forces behind me trying to, starting to study these kind of things in the soul. I was watching something on Netflix one time, and I think they were talking about demon possession or something, and this, scientist in a lab coat comes on, and he goes, of course, there's no such thing as demons, there's no physical proof for demons. Well, again, they're blind and trapped by this idea that everything has to be physical and everything has to be reduced to the physical. To say there's no physical proof for demons is absurd, because demons are not physical, so why would you look for physical proof for something that's not physical? It's like saying, it's like grabbing a metal detector, going to the beach and looking for plastic. Your metal detector is not going to find plastic. There's two physicalists who are Nobel Prize winner Francis Crick and Christoph, I don't know if I can say his last name right, but I'll just say Christoph K., acknowledge that one of the main attitudes among neuroscience is that the nature of consciousness is a philosophical problem, and so best left to the philosophers. So the problem is that this is not a scientific question. Mm-hmm. Science can't even ask the question, much less answer it. So when the atheists say, well, neuroscience has explained it away, really have no idea what the problem really is. Just because we can show a correlation doesn't mean it's the same thing, and we went over that with the law of identity. So, for example, fire causes smoke, but that doesn't mean that smoke is fire. They're two different things. So sure, I could take a pill and change my mood, but does that mean that all of a sudden that means that I am my brain and that I have no soul? No, it simply means there's a correlation. Now let's get into that a little bit. I can my doing something physical to myself could affect my soul, sure, but at the same time, my soul could also affect the physical. How so? Well, okay, like say for example, if I give my wife, let's say a shopping spree or something, which our anniversary is coming up, and I know she's listening, so I love you, happy anniversary. Let's say I give her a X amount of $1,000 or so to go shopping. That's gonna make her happy. I just did something physical, and that changed her soul. She became happy. But let's say at the same time, I do something non-physical happens. Like let's say I start to think or entertain bad thoughts. I begin to have anxiety and get worried, and I could even possibly get sick. So there's definitely a correlation. Jeffrey Schwartz, who is one of the leading neuroscientists in the world, actually wrote a book called You Are Not Your Brain. He has done phenomenal work, from what I understand, in the area of OCD research. He has shown that so the problem with let's talk about the brain just a little bit. Now, every time you have a thought in your brain, your thoughts kind of make little grooves in your brain. So the way habits are developed is that every time I have a thought about, let's say I see a person I don't like, I see them in my mind, I think I don't like this person. A little groove is carved in my brain. I see them again, I think the same thing. After a while, that groove becomes so deep, I don't even have to think about it. It just naturally happens habitually. So the way to break habits is you have to essentially think differently. Now, Jeffrey Schwartz has shown with people who deal with OCD is by, and I don't want to go into all the steps, but basically he has shown that if you can think differently, you can literally change your brain chemistry by simply thinking differently. Now that is profound, because that shows that something immaterial such as thinking can literally change your brain chemistry, so it can change something physical. So neuroscience is really irrelevant to the question. Again, it's not a scientific question. Science cannot even answer the question, much less ask it. So he would say that no, you're not your brain. And it's interesting to note that by simply thinking differently, you can change your brain composition, your brain chemistry.
Yeah, interesting, because I guess it was B.F. Skinner, but all the behavioralists, if I remember from my Psych 101 class that I admittedly barely passed. But basically their idea was, if you are afraid of riding on an elevator and you have a phobia of riding on elevators, then what you should do is force yourself to ride on an elevator until you're convinced that it's safe. So basically it's by the behavior, by the doing of the thing enough, you change your mind.
Right, which would actually be kind of harmful which is shown to be even harmful to some when they tried flooding and stuff like that. To just exposure.
So this is actually the opposite of that, right? It would change your thoughts and you change your mind. Brain, but I say mind, but what we're actually talking about is our mind changing our brain.
Our brain, and let's give some. There are people who struggle with certain mental disabilities, and the problem is, and again, we're showing here the correlation, because I don't want an atheist to say, well, look, this person has Alzheimer's or they had brain damage and this happened. Well, sure, I'm not denying that. But what I am saying is, again, much like an instrument, if you break an instrument, if you take out the tuning in a guitar or pop a string, you're gonna have a defective a song being played or whatnot. So sure, there are people who have certain types of. In fact, J.P. Moreland talks about him dealing with depression and anxiety, and he talks about it being a biological thing. So sure, whenever there's a chemical imbalance in your brain, you can have things like anxiety. Now, what Jeffrey Schwartz, who has done a great amount of good in this area of OCD and people who deal with depression and anxiety, has shown that, for example, one of his steps is when you begin to get these thoughts that are really not your thoughts, it is your brain reacting, and in a sense kind of making you feel these things, you have to be able to stop, calm down, assess the situation, and understand that these are not my thoughts. These are not a reflection of reality. This is my chemicals going out of whack. We've experienced this. I don't know if you've ever woken up from a bad dream. You wake up and you still have this overwhelming sense of fear in your body, even though you're at home, you're in bed, everything's fine, but you still have this fear running through your body. So you have to tell yourself it was just a dream and wait till those chemicals kind of pass through. So the point there is that we have volitional free will to act against what our bodies are telling us are doing. Atheists will often say, well, no, your brain is what makes things happen. Let me give an illustration really quick. Aristotle, in regards to free will, Aristotle gave an example. He said, if I move a rock with a staff, he says, I know what moved the rock. The staff did. He goes, I know what moved the staff. My hand did. He said, but what moved me? So this would show that there has to be a stopping point, kind of like the cosmological argument. There has to be a stopping point to even free will, and that is me. Because if an atheist says, well, your brain firing made your hand move, that made the staff move, that made the rock move, I would say, okay, well, time out. What made that brain firing fire? Well, they would have to say, well, another brain firing fired to make that brain fire, to make your hand move, to make the staff move, to make the rock move. Okay, and what? So there's an infinite regress unless there is something immaterial, a stopping point that makes something happen that was not determined or caused to happen, or nothing made it happen. If I lift my arm, I do it freely. So if I have an itch, because people say, well, I had an atheist one time tell me, well, if you were shot in the air, because I was giving that bullet example, and they said, well, if you were strapped to that bullet, you couldn't defy the laws of gravity either. You have to obey the laws of chemistry and physics. And I said, well, first of all, you're essentially saying if I were strapped to a bullet, in other words, you're basically saying if I were just a physical object, I would have to act like a physical object. Well, sure, of course, I'd agree with you. However, the point is, let's say I have an itch on my hand. The chemicals in me are itching, and everything is telling me to scratch, but I have the volitional free will to refrain from scratching. Have you ever tried to resist a cough? It's hard, but you can do it. Your body is trying to do something. You're reacting to something, but you are perfectly in the position with free will to refrain from doing something. And that takes something like a soul.
Gotcha. Let me try to summarize it with this, and then I wanna bring it to kind of a conclusion in terms of what does happen when we die. What is the Christian understanding of that? If all we are is matter, and all we are is biology, and I realize that if a naturalist were here, I'm sure they'd disagree with what I'm about to say. But wouldn't we all like the same flavor of ice cream? I mean, it's summer. We're eating a lot of ice cream. My daughter likes strawberry ice cream. I'm a big vanilla bean fan. My wife says I'm boring. She likes all the chocolate ice cream with the big chunks of candy in it and the big nuts and everything. And my son pretty much will take whatever he's given at this point, but he's only 4. His soul is developing a preference for ice cream. But my point is that if our decisions were about survival, or at base about about survival, I don't know another way to put it, at their heart, I mean, it seems like there would be an optimum flavor of ice cream. But in fact, what we see is that you get 10 people in a room, you ask them what their flavor of ice cream is, and you'll probably get 10 or more. I mean, we are just fundamentally different. Human beings can't hardly agree on anything. So it seems like if we were the same kind of being, which we are human beings, that we would have evolved along the same way and along the same line to essentially have the same preferences for our institutional survival. But in fact, what we see is that we have differences about what kind of music we like, what kind of ice cream we like, what kind of food that we like, what kind of clothes we should wear, what the siren should sound like on ambulances, because in Europe, they have a different sound. So it just goes, the diversity among human beings, it seems like can only be explained by a spirit or the existence of a soul. But maybe I'm begging the question. So I guess my question to you would be, if we are not bodies and souls that comprise our being, shouldn't we all like the same flavor of ice cream? And I guess what a naturalist and atheist would say is that, well, different mutations happen, different, which, okay, we maybe you could say that, but what I often hear is and I do understand what you're saying, is they'll say something like, why men are attracted to women with blonde hair, or why women are attracted to men with beards, and they'll go into this reductionistic view of, well, because of your brain and this happens, and because of evolution, men with this and that look more attracted to, and the chemical and this and that, and they forget the whole point is that I chose my wife because I loved her, and I found her attractive, and I found her to be a great person, not because of some chemical in my brain and body. Just like the itch example, I can refrain from scratching, just like I can refrain from following some type of a chemical proclivity. So yeah, what they'll say is the reason you like this kind of ice cream is because, well, in your brain you have this mutation to like this or that, and the reason your son or wife likes this is because they have this or that mutation. But I hear your point in saying is that, well, there should be some type of
of driving force that is, and of course I guess I could always appeal to time and say, well, they just give it more time and everything will kind of go into this bottleneck and whatnot. But certainly there is this idea that they have is to reduce every sort of preference or inclination to something
Right.
physical. And like we said earlier, in some cases, sure, there are inclinations that are due to chemical imbalances in our brain, and I won't deny that. But again, just like a guitar string popping makes the music not sound as good, a chemical imbalance in my brain not functioning properly, sure, will also will have effects on my thoughts and whatnot.
Gotcha.
If I were strapped into a car, and let's say I couldn't get out of the car, it would mean that my ability to go left or right would depend on how well the car moves. If the car is broken down and I'm trapped in the car, then I can't move unless I can get out the car. So as long as I am in my body, I am limited to the properly functioning abilities of my body and the capacities and faculties in my soul to exercise that. But if I mess up some part of my eyes, my bodies, my taste buds, whatnot, then sure, then I have this broken instrument, if you will.
Gotcha. I'm a pastor. I've done funerals before. The temptation is always to tell people when someone dies, well, no, now they're in heaven. Okay. And I don't always have the heart, but in Sunday school or in sermons, I'll explain that actually I'm not sure that is the case. What Paul says is that when we die, we are in Christ. And he pretty much limits it to that. I don't want to get into the whole thing. I mean, my ultimate view, and William Lane Craig has espoused this as well, that when Christ comes again with the final judgment, that is when the fullness of our bodies and souls, reunited as such, will be in the fullness of heaven or the fullness of hell. But that when we die now, those who are in Christ die in Christ and go maybe to paradise, is what, like when Jesus says, "Today you will be with me in paradise," to the thief on the cross. And then there's allusions to Hades, which is a kind of a spirit world or a shadow world, or Sheol might be a Hebrew concept for that as well. But my point is that a lot of people think, they think, okay, well, when someone dies, then they go to heaven right away, and body and soul are there together. But in fact, my understanding is that what happens when the Christian dies is that they are in Christ, and that their soul continues to live, but their body truly does rot in the ground. Or if they've been cremated, then their body is reduced to ashes, and I suppose dispersed in an ocean or a lake or held in a canister or whatever. God must be awfully powerful if he can put those ashes back together and reconstitute a body. But it is only when Christ comes again that the resurrection takes place. And his own resurrection, which is a prototype, if you will, or the forerunner of our own bodies, where that comes to fruition. Let me read a quick quote as well. This is from Paul addresses this in 2 Corinthians 5. I'll read the first 5 verses, and then I want to get your thoughts on it as well. He says, "For we know that if the tent, that is our heavenly home," let me start over. "For we know that if the tent, that is our earthly home, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling, if indeed by putting it on we may not be found naked. For while we are still in this tent, we groan, being burdened, not that we would be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. He who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has given us the Spirit as a guarantee." And somewhere there's a passage where, although we couldn't find it on the spot, but there's a passage where Paul talks about how he hopes that Jesus will come again so that he doesn't have to exist in a way separated from his body. So Paul seems to definitely understand that existence will carry on. That was an assumption that, and by the way, even Jews didn't agree on this. There's that famous debate between the Sadducees and the Pharisees about the resurrection. Now, none of them assumed the resurrection that Christ gave. I mean, it was a resurrection that either life would come to an end, as I understand it, or that life would continue in some form. But the idea that your body would continue on in this perfected way, in this glorified way, that might also, by the way, bear scars, which is a whole other topic, because Christ still has the wounds of the crucifixion. But that body would be reconstituted in a new way and be reunited with the soul. that was an original idea, if you will, or a revelation. I would say it was the revelation of God that was completed in the work of Christ. But any thoughts on what we've been talking about in terms of the existence of a soul and what happens when we die?
Sure. And again, I'd first like to go to the point is that for the afterlife to even be possible, you cannot be merely your body. Now there are some theologians who don't even agree that the soul exists. They would agree with the naturalists, and they would say that when your body dies, you cease to exist. You don't have a soul because your brain is your soul. So once your brain ceases to function, you cease to function. And when Christ comes back, he simply recreates you. There's a lot of problems with that, aside from it being unbiblical, because even Paul says that there's going to be a state of nakedness where you're not going to have you're not going to have a tent. And as you were alluding to, he says he hopes that he can just wait until Christ comes, that he doesn't die before Christ comes, so he doesn't have to be in the state of nakedness without a body. So there is a state where you exist without a body if you die prior to Christ coming. So right now, the people who are existing are not resurrected, but they are existing somewhere. He in fact even alludes to that when he's debating with the Sadducees, and he says, well, you don't believe in the resurrection. Well, you believe, one of your famous verses is that God is the God of the living, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, the Bible says that he's the God of the living. If he's their God, then they're still living somewhere. They still exist. So
doesn't he get out of the pickle by doing that, basically, because he's got two different groups? Isn't it the Pharisees and the Sadducees that are...
Paul did that, yeah.
Yeah. So he's like, he pits them against each other, and then they can't agree, so they let him go, I think.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, there's several different of those trials, and I maybe get them mixed up. But anyway, yeah.
So for this to even be possible, you can't be merely your body. Now you bring up an interesting point, because you talked about maybe even scars possibly being there because Christ had, his wounds, or rather his scars were still there. And the next question would be, what about the people who are cremated? Well, here's an interesting point, is that God could switch you with someone else's body, and you see this in movies and all the time in popular culture. You see movies, trying to wrestle with this idea, me switching bodies with someone else. But God couldn't switch you with another soul, because you are your soul. But if you're not your body, then you can. It could be very well that, let's say, if God forbid, I were to pass away and my body would be cremated, or if I died in a fire, God could easily recreate another body because I still exist. So He can easily give me another shell. So, again, for that to even be possible, I have to be more than my body. So, to kind of conclude, to have free will, you need a soul. You can't just be a brain, because it only reacts. Much like a Coke machine can only give me Cokes, not sing me a song. To even have responsibilities such as morality, I have to be my free choice. To be the same person as I am in 10 years, I have to be more than my body, because my body is always switching parts, losing cells and whatnot. Well, if I'm not the same person or body as I was even a minute ago, how am I still the same person? Well, because I'm not my body. We talked about the states of consciousness and whatnot, but again, all this can only be possible if you have something more than your body. So if there's an afterlife, it would only be possible if I am a soul, if I am something immaterial. So again, we are substance dualists, which means we are made of two things: a physical substance and an immaterial substance.
Okay. I know that was a wonderful summary, but I do want to say one more thing, because I think it's a question that people would have. In other words, if since you are your soul, then God could give you a new body, and it might include the scar that's on my shin, or it might not. I mean, I don't think that our bodies may necessarily be comparable to Christ, because the reason that he would retain his scars is first of all for his disciples, to prove that he wasn't his twin brother that showed up on the scene later. I mean, it was like, I'm the one who was crucified. Thomas, put your hand on my side. So there was a kind of a purpose behind him retaining his scars, and I mean, our salvation comes through his wounds. So it seems to make sense that Jesus would retain his scars, even though we may not. But the other question that people would ask, I think, is what about a young a person born with a crippling disease, and they spend their whole life in a wheelchair? Is that the body that they're going to get when they die? What about a fetus who never even makes it out of the womb, who maybe is aborted or dies in the womb or something? Well, we're not going to get into this, but we would assume that they have a soul at the point of conception. We would agree on that, right? That is the point with the soul is given to the person. Now, I'm sure other Christians disagree with that, but That would be your view. That would be my view. So, are we saying that a tiny little fetus at the point of conception, not even called a fetus yet, probably? I don't know all those terms, a zygote or an embryo or something. Is that the body they get when they're in heaven? So, I think we would want to affirm, not to say anything against, certain. And this is going to sound harsh, maybe, but certain benefits coming from a handicap, because even in suffering, God can bring good from it. So I don't want to minimize the gifts of certain handicaps by saying, well, everything will all be better for you in the end, because there are people who live with disabilities now who say, it's not the curse that you tell me. But putting that aside, or not putting it aside, but just not dealing with all the complexities of that at the moment. My point is that I just wanted to affirm that if God can give us another shell for our body, then that is a powerful thing that we need to be able to say to people. If they're cremated, I think that's exactly right. I think that is a legitimate question that comes up. Or even, I think, if you've ever go to Paris and they have the catacombs, I mean, they have hundreds of thousands of bodies that are just bones now that are carefully stacked in these like underground caverns and stuff. Cause they had the city grew so much they had to take this entire cemetery, gut it, move all the bodies, and this took like years to do. Exhume all the bodies and move them to these catacombs. It's really bizarre, but how is God going to reconstitute that? Then you have the Valley of the Dry Bones. That's the image that always comes to my mind. But the point is that if you're a tiny baby when you die, or if you perhaps have a disability, or if when you die, say you had to have your legs amputated or something, that God would be able to reconstitute the body. But we're not saying with any certainty what exactly that's like. We're simply saying that because we are not our body,
right,
that there is an openness for that coming to be. Well, Eric, thanks very much for coming in today. I really appreciate your time. This has really been enlightening and very interesting for me. One more time, to find Eric, it's Eric Hernandez Ministries. Is that right?
Yes, sir. EricHernandezMinistries.com. You can go on Facebook as well, and we even have a YouTube channel with videos.
Awesome. And you can find me at emc2 at felchouston.org, and that's the church's website as well, www.felchouston.org. Until next time, folks, may you have the peace that passes all understanding. See ya. Mischievous and devious trouble finds me listening to the man that's south of my head. Ears are ringing, spines are tingling, out of patience, delirious insistence might as well instead.